Hello, and welcome back to Thinking Deliberately. We have now finished the first foundation arc, and we've looked at thinking as the problem, we've looked at the self as a construction, we've explored dynamic intelligence, and we've introduced the awareness quotient. We've challenged the myth of personality, and in the last episode, we brought together the four pillars of conscious construction, which are intention, awareness, choice, and response. Now we move into more dangerous territory. This is episode 7 and season 2. Today it's called The Lie of Emotional Intelligence, and I'll explain why. Because for the next few episodes, I want to start pulling apart some of the ideas that have become strangely sacred in psychology, coaching, leadership, education, and even self-development. I want to start with one of the big ones, emotional intelligence. Now, before anyone gently clutches their lanyard at a leadership conference, let me be clear. I am not saying that emotion does not matter. Of course, emotions matter. People like Lisa Feldman Barrett have been doing this research for 25 years. Emotions can shape attention, they can influence meaning and color memory. They might affect our judgment, they definitely affect our judgment, change behavior, and then emotion moves through relationships, teams, organizations, families, classrooms, boardrooms, you get the point, right? Even political movements. Emotion matters enormously, but that does not mean that emotional intelligence measures what people think it measures. And it certainly does not mean it is in the grand solution to human development. In fact, I think emotional intelligence may be one of the most successful half ideas of modern psychology. Useful enough to spread, vague enough to sell, comforting enough to avoid deeper questions. And that's the problem. Emotional intelligence sounds like it should be important. It sounds humane and it sounds mature. It sounds like the antidote to cold rationality, poor leadership or bad communication, and emotionally illiterate workplaces. And in some ways, it was a useful correlation. It reminded people that intelligence is not merely cognitive. It reminded leaders that feelings exist and that apparently that was a breakthrough. But the concept has been stretched so widely now that it covers almost anything people want it to cover. And I've got a list. Self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, motivation, social skills, relationship management, influence, communication, leadership presence, emotional vocabulary, being nice in meetings, not shouting at Janet from finance. At some point, a model becomes so broad that it stops explaining and starts absorbing. That is where emotional intelligence often sits. It absorbs complexity and then pretends to have explained it. Someone is good with people, emotional intelligence. Someone stays calm under pressure, emotional intelligence. Someone seems empathetic, emotional intelligence. What about if they manage conflict? Yep, emotionally intelligent. Someone is persuasive, composed, relationally skilled, and socially confident. Must be emotional intelligence. Okay, fine, but what exactly has been measured? What is the underlying developmental mechanism? What is the person aware of? And going back to every episode so far, what are they constructing? What's their intention? What choices are genuinely available to them? At what level of awareness are they responding? So emotional intelligence often does not answer any of these questions. It simply describes desirable social and emotional behaviors and then gives them a flattering name. That is not enough. Because from a constructive development theory perspective, the critical issue is not whether someone can recognize or manage emotion. The critical issue is whether they are aware of how they are constructing emotion. Meaning, self, context, and response in a moment. That's a very different order of inquiry. And let me make this a little bit sharper. You can be emotionally fluent and still be developmentally unaware. You can name your feelings and still be controlled by them. You can say, I feel unsafe, when what you mean is, someone disagree with me and I don't like it. You can even say, I need boundaries, when what you mean is, I want distance without responsibility. You could say, I am protecting my energy, when what you mean is, I am avoiding a difficult conversation. You might even say, I'm being authentic. We see that a lot on LinkedIn. When what you mean is, I'm giving myself permission to be unfiltered. And you can say, I'm an empath, when what you mean is, I have made other people's emotions central to my identity. And we could talk about that as well, because it also means you're not in control. You just think you are. Emotional language can become awareness, but it can also become camouflage. And that's the point. Having language for emotion does not automatically produce awareness of construction. Sometimes it just gives unconsciousness better vocabulary. This is why emotional intelligence can be so seductive. It lets people feel developed because they can talk about feelings. But talking about feelings is not the same as being aware of how those feelings are constructed, protected, performed, interpreted, and so on. A person may say, I am angry. That's great. That might even be useful. But CDT asks, what have you constructed that makes anger the available response? I would say, how have you constructed anger? Have you constructed disagreement as respect? Have you constructed feedback as an attack? Maybe difference is the threat. No. Have you constructed your identity as something that must be not be questions? Must not be questions. Have you constructed yourself as morally superior? Because if you do not examine the construction, you may simply regulate the anger while leaving the underlying meaning intact. And that's not development. That is emotional tidying. And we have built entire industries around emotional tidying, workshops on communication, courses on resilience, training on empathy, frameworks for difficult conversations. What about leadership programs full of laminated models and tasteful diagrams? And still, people leave the room and construct themselves from the same level of awareness. That's why my workshops focus on how you think, not what you think. They now have better language. They now know to say, I hear you. They now understand that shouting is not ideal, and that's all great. But are they more aware? Can they see their intention? Can they notice the identity being defended? And for me, it would be about, can they construct more than one meaning in the moment? Can you choose a response under pressure? Can they say and see when emotional regulation is actually image management? That is the deeper issue. Emotional intelligence often mistakes behavioral competence for developmental awareness. Someone appears calm, so we call them emotionally intelligent, but calm is not always aware. Calm might be control, disassociation, superiority, fear, wearing a suit. And calm, is a well-trained professional mask. Sometimes calm is what happens when someone has learned to suppress everything inconvenient and call it maturity. Likewise, emotional expressiveness is not always awareness. Sometimes it is simply unregulated construction pouring into the room. Someone cries, someone shares, someone speaks passionately, someone says, I'm just being vulnerable. Well, maybe. Or maybe they are using emotion to shape the room. Maybe they are making their feelings the most important object in the conversation. Maybe they're constructing accountability as harm or vulnerability to avoid challenge. And this is why we need a more precise model, not an anti-emotion, even more precise. Emotional intelligence asks broadly, can you understand and manage emotion? Constructive development theory asks, from what level of awareness is the emotion being constructed, interpreted, used, and responded to? And that is a much harder question. And it is much harder to fake because a person can perform emotional intelligence. They can learn the phrases, the body language, nodding at the right time and saying things like, oh, that must be difficult. They can pause before responding. They can use soft tone or open posture and pretend it's like an emotionally intelligent theatre. But CDT asks, what is the intention underneath the performance? Is the person genuinely aware? Or are they constructing themselves as emotionally intelligent because that is the approved identity in the room? This is especially important in leadership. Modern leadership has become obsessed with emotional intelligence. Leaders are told to be empathic, authentic, vulnerable, emotionally aware, psychologically safe, which is even taught at university, inclusive, rational, and compassionate. Again, none of that is bad, but without developmental awareness, these qualities can become performance scripts. A leader can perform vulnerability strategically. They can use empathy to gain loyalty. Are you thinking of politicians at this point? They can use psychological safety language to appear progressive while avoiding real power sharing. And they can say, my door is always open, while unconsciously constructing challenge as disloyalty. They can say, I value feedback, while subtly punishing anyone who gives it. They can speak the language of emotional intelligence while still constructing leadership from ego or fear. And that's not emotional intelligence. That is emotional branding. And organizations love emotional branding. It looks good on a leadership framework. It sounds warm in a values statement. It photographs well at the annual conference. But it doesn't necessarily change the level of awareness from which decisions are made. That is the missing piece. The question is not whether a leader can talk about emotions. The question is whether the leader can become aware of the construction of self, context, and response while power is moving through the room. Because power changes the construction. Status changes the construction. Fear changes it. Even ambition changes it. The person may know all the emotional vocabulary in the world, but if they cannot see what power, identity, and intention are doing in the moment, their emotional intelligence is very shallow. And this is why dynamic intelligence goes further. And at this point, I'd like to say that in my original research, I said that emotional intelligence is subsumed under dynamic intelligence. Let me explain that a little bit. Dynamic intelligence includes emotion, but it does not stop there. It asks how emotion is being constructed through meaning. It asks what intention is shaping the response. It asks what awareness is available. It asks what choices can actually be constructed. And it asks whether the response is deliberate or merely socially polished. And that last phrase is useful because socially polished, a lot of what gets called emotional intelligence is just social polish, good manners, composure, charm, relational skills, funny lecturers, professional diplomacy. Useful, pretty much. Developmental, not necessarily. A person can be socially polished and completely unaware of themselves. They can be charming and manipulative, empathic and controlling, composed and avoidant, warm and strategic, emotionally literate and developmentally stuck. And that's why we need to stop treating emotional intelligence as if it is the apex of human capacity. It's not. At best, it's part of the story. At worst, it's a comforting label that allows people to avoid deeper developmental work. So the real question is not how emotionally intelligent are you? The real question is how aware are you of the construction from which your emotional responses are emerging? That question is a little harder because it does not it doesn't let you hide behind emotional vocabulary. It doesn't let you call every discomfort a boundary or every reaction authenticity. It asks you to look at the construction. And that is where many people would rather not look. Because once you begin to see the construction itself, you may discover that your emotions are not simply truths arriving from the deep, authentic self. They are responses shaped by meaning, memory, identity, body, culture, habit, all of the above. And those are real, but they are not always accurate. They matter, but they are not always wise. And they deserve attention, but they do not automatically deserve obedience. And that is a crucial distinction. Emotion is information, but it is not always instruction. And emotional intelligence often fails because it does not sufficiently distinguish between feeling, meaning, awareness, and response. However, constructed development theory does. It says, what am I intending? What am I aware of? What choices are available? What response am I constructing? Emotion moves through all four, but emotion is not the whole system. This is why I think emotional intelligence is incomplete. It sees something important, but stops too early. It recognizes emotion, but often misses construction. It values regulation, but often misses awareness. And it values empathy, but it often misses intention. And because it stops too early, it can produce people who sound emotionally intelligent while continuing to construct themselves from the same old level of awareness. And that's not enough. The world does not need more people who can perform emotional maturity. It needs people who can become aware of their construction in real time. People who can notice when emotion is shaping meaning or when meaning is protecting identity. People who can notice when identity is narrowing choices and maybe notice when response is about to become repetition. That is dynamic intelligence. That is awareness quotient, which is all constructed development theory. And that is why I don't think emotional intelligence is wrong exactly. I just think it's too small, it's too vague, it's too easy to perform, it's too easily commercialized, and it's too easily mistaken for development, and too easily used by people who want to appear aware without doing the harder work of becoming aware. So here is the uncomfortable question for this episode. Are you emotionally intelligent? Or have you simply learned the language of emotional intelligence? Can you name your feelings? Great. But can you see how you are constructing them? Can you regulate yourself? Yes. But can you tell whether you are regulating, suppressing, controlling, avoiding, performing, or protecting an image? Maybe you can show empathy, but can you see whether your empathy is genuinely for the other person or whether it serves your need to be seen as good? So, can you stay calm? That's great. But is your calm awareness or is it distance? This is where the work begins, not with emotion alone, with awareness of construction. Because until you can see how emotion, meaning, identity, and response are being constructed in the moment, emotional intelligence remains incomplete. It's useful, it's marketable, but it's incomplete. And this is thinking deliberately. So today's uncomfortable thought is this. Emotional intelligence may help you manage your feelings, but it may not show you the self that is constructing them. And that self is where the real work begins. Thank you.